Harriet Monroe had always been a discreet woman. At 64, her serene expression bore the marks of decades of accumulated silence. Life had taught her to speak little and endure much, perhaps because she understood from an early age that her voice rarely found a place among those she loved most. A daughter of the countryside, shaped by her father's strictness and her mother's almost secret tenderness, she grew up among vineyards, learning that the land demands patience, care, and a courage that is not displayed, it simply sustains. That late autumn, as the cold began to gild the leaves of the vineyard, Harriet walked slowly through the rows of grapes. It wasn't just the weather that gave her a constant shiver. It was the memory of Lydia, her sister, whose absence now seemed like an echo in every vine. Lydia had been her confidant, her most loyal companion, the woman who, despite their differences, always reminded her that her existence had value. With her death, Harriet felt as if a part of the world had been emptied. However, Lydia had left behind more than just memories. An unexpected will had given Harriet not only material possessions, but also a massive legacy. 250 acres of vineyards, 400 head of cattle, a classic Cadillac kept as an heirloom, and a sum of $1.8 million. It was as if, with this final gesture, her sister had placed absolute trust in her, believing that Harriet could preserve not only the land, but also the family's memory. But the inheritance didn't just bring comfort. It also brought old shadows back to the surface. The day of Lydia's funeral, when friends, neighbors, and even journalists gathered to bid farewell to the woman known for her generosity and hard work, should have been a moment of collective mourning. Instead, it became the stage for the most painful rupture of Harriet's life. Vanessa, her daughter, appeared after 8 years of silence. 8 years since she had accused her of cowardice for not financing her husband's failing business. 8 years of unanswered letters, blocked phone calls, and avoided meetings. Harriet hadn't expected to see her that day. Much less had she imagined that, in front of everyone, her daughter would choose to hit her most vulnerable spot. The speech began quietly, but soon took on the air of a public accusation. "Parasite!" Vanessa shouted, raising her voice so it echoed against the chapel's stained glass windows. "You don't deserve anything you got. That was Aunt Lydia's, not yours. You've taken advantage of her your entire life." The silence of those present was instantaneous, as if the air had been sucked out of them. Harriet remained motionless, her hands trembling on the black handkerchief she clutched, as each of her daughter's words struck her like a calculated blow. No one dared intervene. Some looked away, others stared uncomfortably, and there were still those who whispered, believing Vanessa's sharp words. Harriet, however, didn't respond. Her silence wasn't empty. It was instinctive defense of someone who had learned that screaming wasn't always survival. Inside, she felt torn apart, but outwardly, she remained erect, like the old vines that endure the harshest winter. It was at that moment, at the height of her humiliation, that something began to shift. Harriet realized that if she remained silent forever, she would lose not only her sister's inheritance, but also her own dignity. Vanessa's attack wasn't just about possessions. It was about history, her identity, and her right to exist with respect. For the first time, a flame of resistance began to burn, timid but undeniable. The following days brought confirmation of what had been announced. Vanessa hadn't just kept her words. She hired lawyers, spread rumors in the local press, insinuated that her mother wasn't sane enough to manage the vineyard, and attempted to freeze the inheritance in court. To top it all off, she forged alliances with investors interested in converting the land into real estate developments. It was a calculated offensive, seeking not only money, but also Harriet's complete disgrace. In this scenario, Harriet could have succumbed, but she was not alone. Samuel, the vineyard manager, remained loyal, reminding her daily that the land recognizes those who respect it. Elena, a longtime friend and retired judge, offered wise counsel and the promise of moral support. Maxwell, a lawyer known for his meticulousness, took the case seriously. And Clara Ara, a young journalist passionate about the truth, began recording every detail of the battle, transforming the narrative into something greater than mere family disputes. Still, Harriet carried the weight of fear. She feared her daughter's voice would be louder, that the lies would echo more than the truth, and that in the end, her decades-long silence would render her too invisible to be heard now. But there was also a new, still unfamiliar sensation, the certainty that she was at a crossroads. Either she would allow herself to be crushed by Vanessa's contempt, or she would reinvent herself, transforming grief into fuel for resistance. In the solitude of her home at night, Harriet would pick up her sister's old letters and reread them. In one, Lydia had written, "A man's worth lies not in how much he shouts, but in how long he stands when they try to tear him down." These words became her silent mantra. Perhaps Lydia knew before she left that the inheritance wouldn't just be about land or money, but about courage. The morning after the funeral, the silence in the house seemed heavier than ever. Harriet woke early, as usual, but her movements were different. She made coffee in a china cup Lydia liked, watched the smoke rise, and realized that every detail of the room seemed charged with a hidden message. It was time to act. She couldn't allow her sister's memory to be dragged into the mire of public accusations. It was that same day that Maxwell knocked on the door. The lawyer, with his impeccable gray suit and penetrating gaze, brought with him not only legal strategies, but also an almost contagious sense of calm. "Your rights are clear, Harriet," he said firmly. "The will is in order, but it's not just about proving it in court. You have to show who you are in front of everyone." Harriet listened in silence, but inside, a battle raged. How could a woman, accustomed to retreating now, be at the center of such a noisy dispute? Meanwhile, Vanessa intensified her campaign. On social media, inflammatory posts were shared hundreds of times, accusing Harriet of manipulating her elderly aunt to extort her inheritance. Local newspapers carried headlines insinuating that the mysterious widow was unfit to manage a farming empire. Harriet, who had spent her life out of the spotlight, suddenly found herself transformed into a public spectacle, where her dignity was shamelessly questioned. Clara Ara was the one who realized the danger of a single narrative. The young journalist, with her notebooks full of notes and a tape recorder always at hand, approached Harriet with a look that seemed to see beyond the surface. "Let me tell your version," she urged. "People need to know the real story. Silence can be misinterpreted." Harriet hesitated. The idea of exposing her private life was uncomfortable, but she also understood that without a voice she would be just a shadow of the portrait Vanessa had painted. Clara Ara's first article didn't offer sensationalism, but humanity. It described Harriet as the guardian of a legacy, someone who saw the vineyard as not just a source of profit, but also as a source of roots. It spoke of her relationship with Lydia, the letters exchanged over the years, and the implicit promise to care for what had been built with sweat and memory. The impact was immediate. Amid supportive comments and renewed criticism, a change emerged. Harriet was no longer just a target, but also a figure of resistance. The manager became even more present during this period. He accompanied her daily through the vineyard rows, reminding her that the land responded to care and that this was living proof of her competence. "Those who tread this land feel it," he said, his voice firm. "There's history here, Harriet, and no one who truly loves you can sell this as if it were just soil." These words reinforced the conviction that was beginning to blossom within her. The fight was not just about possession, but about honor. Still, the days were exhausting. Preliminary hearings, endless paperwork, and Vanessa's cold stare in the courtroom sapped Harriet's energy. Her daughter seemed to thrive on the struggle, while she needed every shred of courage to stand tall. In moments of weakness, she wondered, was it her past rigidity that had driven Vanessa away? Or had her daughter always been driven solely by ambition? These questions haunted her, but never completely paralyzed her. Elena, the retired E, was the one who brought clarity to this dilemma. One afternoon, while they were drinking tea on the porch, her friend said softly but bluntly, "You don't have to answer for everything that went wrong with Vanessa. Everyone chooses their own path. What you need to decide now is whether you're going to let this wound continue to bleed or whether you're going to turn it into a scar." Harriet felt a strange relief, as if someone had lifted some of the weight she'd been carrying. The nights, however, were still the hardest. On many of them, Harriet would sit on the porch, gazing at the stars and listening to the wind rustle through the vineyards. She imagined Lydia there, laughing as she used to, and sometimes she would talk to herself, asking her absent sister for advice. This silent dialogue strengthened her. Somehow, she believed Lydia was guiding her, as if she had foreseen this battle would become inevitable. And then came the first major setback. At a hearing, Vanessa's lawyers presented falsified documents suggesting that Harriet suffered from frequent memory lapses and was cognitively unfit to manage the inheritance. The impact was devastating. Harriet left the courtroom feeling struck to her core. Not only were they trying to take away her land, but now they were trying to strip her of her very identity. It was Samuel who supported her that afternoon, walking her home in silence. When they parked, he said simply, "Don't let her venom become truth within." "You!" Harriet wept silently, but in that cry there was more than pain. There was anger, and with it a new kind of energy she had never known. The next day, Harriet woke up different. The mirror reflected a tired woman, yes, but also determined. She could no longer afford to simply endure. Now she needed to act decisively, not only to defend Lydia's legacy, but to redeem herself. For the first time in years, she felt that the silence that had always defined her was no longer enough. It was time to speak out. The morning after the hearing, Harriet found Maxwell already ensconced in her living room, surrounded by folders and documents. The ever-meticulous lawyer had spent the night reviewing every detail of the case. "They want to question your sanity, but they can't support it without contradicting themselves," he explained, sliding a stack of papers toward her. "What we need is irrefutable proof of your sanity, testimony, records, letters." Harriet looked at the pile of memories and realized that her entire life was about to be put under scrutiny. It was at that moment that Lydia's letters became more than just mementos. Harriet handed them to Maxwell, carefully preserved in wooden boxes. Each contained detailed accounts of conversations, plans, and decisions made together. The letters demonstrated not only Harriet's sanity, but also Lydia's absolute trust in her. Maxwell smiled quietly as he leafed through the papers. "This is gold," he said. "Not just legal, but human. This is where you see who your sister really was and who you are." Clara also found her opportunity to act. Armed with a tape recorder and her youthful restlessness, she began interviewing vineyard workers, neighbors, and even Lydia's former colleagues. Each account offered important nuances, stories of how Harriet closely monitored the grape growing, decisions she made about harvests and investments, and her constant care for the land. "She's not a detached woman," said one of the workers. "She's the one who makes sure everything stays together." These voices formed a narrative more powerful than any written defense. Meanwhile, Vanessa intensified her media offensive. Maliciously edited photos, supposed anonymous accounts from employees, and insinuations that Harriet was being manipulated by third parties began to circulate. But for the first time, Harriet didn't just feel fear, she felt outrage. Each new lie seemed to reinforce her determination to deny it, not with shouts, but with tangible truths. It was Elena who suggested the community meeting. "You need to talk to those who matter," she advised. "The people here know you. They know Lydia. The court decides laws, but the community decides reputations, and reputation can be harder to recover than any property." Harriet, still unsure, accepted. Clara Ara herself had publicized the invitation, making the meeting a highly anticipated event. In the days leading up to the meeting, Harriet underwent an intense preparation routine. Samuel accompanied her on long walks through the vineyards, repeating that she carried more than an inheritance. She carried the memory of everyone who had worked that land. Maxwell practiced clear, firm answers with her, so she wouldn't waver in the face of hostile questions. Elena, with her courtroom experience, reinforced, "Confidence is transmitted through the eyes. Don't lower your head to anyone." The night before the meeting, Harriet barely slept. She sat on the porch with a cup of tea and let her mind wander through the decades past. The nights she'd cradled Vanessa in her arms, the days of laughter with Lydia, the lonely afternoons wondering if it was worth carrying on. Each memory formed an invisible thread leading her to this point. It was no longer just about defending land or money. It was about proving to herself that she still had a voice. The day arrived. The small town's common room was packed. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of neighbors, Lydia's old friends, curious onlookers, and even journalists. Vanessa was also present, along with lawyers and allies with calculating looks. Harriet, in a simple dark blue dress and a pearl necklace inherited from her mother, seemed fragile at first glance, but those who looked closely noticed something different. Her shoulders were high, her expression firm. As she stepped onto the makeshift pulpit, silence filled the space. Harriet took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "I spent my life believing that silence was my way of surviving," she began, her voice trembling but audible. "But today I understand that silence can also be interpreted as consent, and I will not consent to see my sister's memory and my own story distorted by interests that do not represent who we are." She then presented Lydia's letters one by one. She read excerpts in which her sister spoke of her trust in her admiration for her strength, and her certainty that only Harriet could keep the family legacy alive. She then showed recordings and testimonies collected by Clara Ara, all confirming her competence and dedication to the vineyard. With each piece of evidence presented, the audience's expressions changed. The initial murmur of doubt turned to attention and, finally, to support. Vanessa tried to intervene, standing up to object, but Harriet, for the first time in decades, was undeterred. She fixed her daughter with her eyes and said, "You can try to destroy my reputation, Vanessa, but you can't destroy the truth. I didn't just inherit land, I inherited responsibility, and responsibility isn't for sale." The impact was immediate. The silence that followed was so thick it seemed to fill every corner of the room. In that moment, Harriet realized something irrevocable had happened. She was no longer the woman cornered by her daughter's contempt. She was someone who, for the first time, dared to occupy the space that had always been denied her. And in front of everyone, Vanessa's narrative began to crumble. The community meeting's impact was immediate. The very next day, local newspapers carried headlines like "Harriet Monroe's voice echoes Lydia's legacy" and "Mother faces daughter's accusations in defense of vineyard." Clara published a detailed report combining evidence and testimonies which circulated widely on social media. For the first time, Harriet felt that public opinion was beginning to shift in her favor. Vanessa, accustomed to controlling the narrative, reacted furiously. She released new statements on social media, accusing her mother of emotional manipulation. She tried to reinforce the idea that Harriet was nothing more than a weak figure, propped up by self-serving allies. But something had changed. The public no longer listened to her with the same credulity. Many began to question her motivations, seeing in her words not justice but greed. Maxwell recognized this shift and used it masterfully. He filed new petitions attaching the community's testimonies, Lydia's letters, and the published articles. "We're taking it apart piece by piece," he said as he reviewed the paperwork with Harriet. What once seemed like a solid attack now turns out to be a plot based on fabrications and resentment. Harriet listened attentively, but what truly sustained her wasn't the legal strategies. It was the feeling of finally standing up in front of everyone. Samuel, in turn, reinforced the human side of this battle. As he led Harriet through the vineyards, he showed her every detail that connected her to this place: a tree Lydia had planted on her 50th birthday, the wine barrel that held the last harvest she oversaw, the small wooden chapel where the family prayed at harvest. "None of this can be sold as just wood and earth," he said, pointing to the golden horizon. These images reinforced Harriet's conviction that her struggle went far beyond the courts. However, Vanessa refused to back down. In a bold move, she tried to convince outside investors to buy part of the vineyard, claiming that the legal proceedings were about to turn in her favor. This maneuver, however, did not go unnoticed. Clara managed to record a conversation in which Vanessa admitted her intention to quickly liquidate the land for immediate profit. The recording came as a bombshell. More than proving her ambition, it exposed her lack of commitment to the family's memory. When the recording became public, the reaction was devastating for Vanessa. Allies began to pull away, investors backed out, and even some lawyers withdrew from the case. Harriet watched this downfall with a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness because she saw her own daughter sinking into such difficult choices, and relief because the truth was finally beginning to emerge. Despite her victories, Harriet wasn't celebrating with euphoria. Her days remained intense, divided between legal meetings, unexpected interviews, and tending the land. She felt the weight of loneliness, especially on cold nights when the echo of Vanessa's words returned to her mind. But now there was a difference. Fear no longer dominated. In its place was a sense of purpose. Elanena watched everything with a practiced eye. "You see," she once said as they walked together through the garden, "your daughter may have started this war, but you are the one who is defining its course. With every choice you make, you show not only who you are, but who you have always been." Harriet reflected on this. Perhaps, indeed, she had spent much of her life letting others write her narrative. Now, finally, she held the pen herself. Over time, Harriet began to notice something curious. Women in the community began seeking her advice. Widows, divorcees, and mature women facing their own abandonment and rejection saw in her a possible mirror of resilience. One of them, named Dolores, confided, "I thought my life was over when my children turned their backs on me. But seeing you standing gives me the strength to believe I can still start over." These conversations began to plant a new idea in Harriet, albeit still embryonic. Meanwhile, Vanessa was trying her last card. In an exclusive interview with a regional channel, she attempted to reverse the narrative, describing herself as a wronged daughter and accusing Harriet of ingratitude. But the interview didn't have the desired effect. The public was already in disbelief, and many comments mocked her. Contradictions. The image of the once proud daughter was now beginning to crumble before the eyes of the community itself. The vineyard, on the other hand, flourished. Under Samuel and Harriet's supervision, that year's harvest promised to be one of the best in decades. It was as if the land itself responded to its owner's new approach, yielding generous fruit amidst the chaos. Harriet walked among the vines with a different kind of pride, not the pride of ownership, but of continuity. With each ripening cluster, she saw a sign that her struggle was not in vain. By the end of this period, Harriet was no longer the same woman who had been attacked at the funeral. She still felt pain, of course. A mother's heart doesn't close easily. But she had found something that had eluded her for decades, the certainty that her life had a voice, value, and purpose of its own. The conflict with Vanessa was far from being just a dispute over inheritance. It was, in fact, proof that Harriet could, indeed, write her own story. With Vanessa's public disgrace, the legal process began to move in Harriet's favor. Maxwell, ever calculating, knew there were still risks, but recognized the growing advantage. "What we have now is not just documentary evidence, Harriet," he said in one of the meetings. "We have public opinion on our side, and that can carry more weight than any stamped paper." Harriet listened silently, but felt that for the first time the scales were tipping in her direction. Meanwhile, Clara continued to document every step. Her stories were no longer just local news, but articles reprinted in regional and even national media outlets. Harriet's image as a woman who resisted defamation and protected a family legacy began to circulate beyond the small town's borders. What had previously been simply an inheritance dispute now became a symbol of something larger, a mature woman's struggle against the erasure of her history. This recognition brought new responsibilities. People from other towns began writing letters and sending messages to Harriet. Widows, rejected mothers, women estranged from their families or diminished in their homes saw in her an example of resilience. "You show us we are not alone," read one anonymous letter received in the mail. Harriet read each one with pent-up emotion, storing them in a box with Lydia's letters. It was then that the idea for the foundation began to take shape. Initially, it emerged in casual conversations with Elena, who provoked her with direct questions. What if you transformed this pain into something collective? What if the vineyard were more than a legacy? It were a meeting place, a place of reconstruction. Harriet didn't answer immediately, but these words resonated with her like seeds planted in fertile soil. In court, Vanessa's attacks no longer held the same force. The recording Clara had exposed had destroyed much of her credibility. Attempts to present new witnesses proved inconsistent. Little by little, what had once seemed like an avalanche against Harriet turned into a mountain of lies crumbling under the weight of the truth. Still, Harriet remained vigilant, aware that a victory was only complete when consolidated in silence and firmness. While awaiting final decisions, Harriet began to dedicate more time to the vineyard. Mornings became rituals of renewal. She walked among the rows of grapes, chatted with workers, reviewed harvest details, and felt the earth return in fruit what she had given in care. On many of these mornings, she remembered Lydia, imagining her smiling among the vines, proud to see her sister transforming pain into purpose. Vanessa, on the other hand, isolated herself. Close friends stopped returning her calls, investors broke off contracts, and her public image became increasingly fragile. Harriet learned from third parties that her daughter had begun selling personal assets to cover legal costs. This news brought her no joy. It only brought the bitter realization that the war had eroded more than legal relations. It had opened an irreparable rift between mother and daughter. Even so, Harriet refused to yield to the temptation for revenge. In conversations with Maxwell, she made it clear, "I want justice, not destruction. If I'm going to win, let it be without turning my daughter into an eternal enemy. She's already lost too much of herself." Maxwell, impressed, simply nodded. This stance showed that Harriet had found a rare balance, firmness without rancor. With each passing week, the vineyard became more vibrant. Clara Ara began recording images and testimonies that showcased not only the struggle, but also the flourishing of the place. These reports took on the tone of inspirational chronicles, showing Harriet walking among rows of grapes at sunset, receiving women seeking advice, and reorganizing spaces on the farm for community gatherings. The narrative of defeat began to transform into one of rebirth. One afternoon, during a meeting with Samuel, Harriet confessed, "I spent decades believing I had nothing to offer but silence. Now I realize I can offer space for others to find their voice." It was at that moment that the idea for the Lydia Monroe Foundation ceased to be a hypothesis and became a promise. Samuel, moved, simply replied, "This will be your sister's true legacy and yours as well." Elenena helped structure the foundation's first formal steps, legal expertise. She drafted bylaws and guided Harriet on how to turn the idea into reality. A pragmatic Maxwell assessed the financial viability, demonstrating that part of the inheritance could be allocated to keeping the initiative sustainable. Harriet, who had previously seen numbers as a burden, now saw them as a tool for liberation. It was as if she was finally building something that gave meaning to her own existence. Deep down, Harriet understood that nothing would erase the wounds her daughter had left. But as she looked out over the vineyard's horizon, she saw a new landscape taking shape. She was no longer just an heiress defending her land. She was a woman rebuilding, ready to transform her pain into a foundation for other lives. And this thought sustained her more strongly than any legal victory could offer. The final hearings arrived with an air of inevitable outcome. Maxwell, confident in each argument, presented documentary evidence that refuted the forgeries and reinforced the legitimacy of Lydia's will. Judges, previously attentive to Vanessa's claims, were now clearly skeptical of her contradictory stance. Harriet, seated in the courtroom, didn't need to say much. Her calm presence, accompanied by her steady gaze, spoke volumes. When the decision was announced, Harriet felt a deep silence within her. The court fully recognized her right to the inherited assets and rejected all of her daughter's objections. It was a clear victory, but not euphoric. Harriet didn't smile or celebrate openly. She simply took a deep breath, as if finally freeing herself from a weight she'd carried for much longer than the case itself. Vanessa, upon hearing the sentence, couldn't contain her expression of anger mixed with disbelief. She left the room without looking at her mother, surrounded only by the lawyers who no longer demonstrated the same loyalty. Harriet followed her with her eyes, feeling her heart break once again. This wasn't just her daughter, defeated in a courtroom. This was the girl she had cradled on feverish nights, now consumed by ambition. But Harriet knew she could no longer hold on to this pain. That same day, upon returning to the vineyard, Harriet was greeted by Samuel and some eagerly awaiting workers. There was no noisy celebration, just spontaneous applause, sincere hugs, and respectful looks. For the first time in decades, she felt seen, not as her sister's shadow, not as a target of criticism, but as someone who had faced and overcome. That simple human moment was more valuable than any number recorded in a bank account. Clara turned the victory into a lengthy report. The title was straightforward: Harriet Monroe, the woman who turned pain into legacy. The article spoke not only of the legal battle, but also of her resilience, her quiet strength, and her idea of creating a foundation for mature women. The story resonated beyond the region, reaching national media outlets. Harriet became a symbol, albeit reluctantly, of a greater cause. The Lydia Monroe Foundation was launched weeks later. It initially opened in a renovated wing of the vineyard itself, a former guest house converted into a meeting place, a workshop, and counseling. The first meetings brought together a small group of women, all over 50, who shared stories of rejection, abandonment, and new beginnings. Harriet welcomed them shyly, but also with genuine emotion that she couldn't hide. At each meeting, she saw herself reflected in every face. There were women there who had lost husbands, others estranged from their children, some invisible in their own homes. Harriet didn't need rehearsed speeches. She simply told her own story, showed Lydia's letters, and spoke of the days she felt crushed and the moments she rose again. The silence of the audience, followed by suppressed tears and tight hugs, confirmed that this initiative had profound meaning. Samuel, ever practical, took care of the structural aspects. He ensured that the meetings included coffee, an organized space, and even a few bottles of wine from the recent vintage offered as a token of welcome. Elenina assisted with the legal aspects and advised on how to protect the foundation from future disputes. Maxwell was in charge of structuring the formal documents, while Clara documented everything with photos and text, transforming each meeting into an inspiration for other women who couldn't attend. The vineyard, meanwhile, had become a growing visitor destination. People from the city and neighboring regions came not only to buy wine, but also to learn the history behind it. Harriet, initially resistant to exposure, gradually agreed to walk among visitors, share fragments of her journey, and demonstrate that the vines were more than just crops. They were living memory. Every grape here holds a piece of our history, she would say, and visitors understood that this was no cheap metaphor, but a heartfelt truth. As the months passed, the foundation gained recognition. Small donations began to arrive, some in cash, others in the form of books, clothing, and services. Volunteer psychologists offered to help, lawyers to guide women through separation processes, and even retired teachers to offer late-onset literacy classes. Harriet realized that the cause was no longer just hers, it had become everyone's. Even so, there were nights when loneliness returned. In her silent home, Harriet still thought about Vanessa. She wondered if one day her daughter would be able to understand what she had chosen to defend. But at the same time, she understood that she no longer depended on that answer to continue. She had discovered that love without respect sustains no one, and that life only gains meaning when it transforms pain into a path for others. The vineyard flourished as never before, and Harriet flourished alongside it. She was no longer the cornered woman at the funeral, nor the silent figure who went unnoticed. She was now a beacon of strength, not through the volume of her voice, but through the steadfastness of her example. What had begun as an inheritance dispute became a chapter in a larger story, the overcoming of a woman who refused to be erased. The following months marked the consolidation of the Lydia Monroe Foundation. What began as small gatherings grew in scale. Women arrived from neighboring towns, some traveling hours just to participate in the conversation circles. Harriet was surprised to hear such diverse stories, yet all intertwined with the same thread of pain and hope. Many said they had never had a space to speak, and that now they found a chosen family. With each new encounter, Harriet realized the significance of her decision. More than protecting a vineyard, she was creating a place where other women could rebuild. It was as if each vine was a living symbol of the ability to weather storms. Clara transformed these moments into sensitive articles, which circulated on blogs and regional newspapers, further expanding the support network. Samuel, with his down-to-earth manner, didn't hide his pride. "The vineyard is more alive because you're more alive, Harriet," he once said, as they watched the sunset gilding the rows of grapes together. Harriet smiled silently, but inwardly she recognized the truth. Her energy, once spent enduring absences, now expanded to nourish something collective. It was during this period that the community organized an unexpected tribute. During the harvest, workers and neighbors gathered to host a dinner in Harriet's honor, thanking her for not allowing Lydia's memory to be sold as a cipher. When she entered the shed illuminated by simple lights and saw the tables decorated with wild flowers, Harriet felt a rare emotion: belonging. For the first time, she wasn't just a spectator of the life around her, she was an essential part of it. But life isn't all about victories. Vanessa's reunion happened abruptly, weeks later. She showed up unannounced, parking in front of the vineyard in a rental car. She was visibly dejected, her haughty features replaced by an almost physical exhaustion. Harriet, seeing her get out, felt her heart race. Part of her wanted to run and hug her. Another part feared reopening a wound that had barely begun to heal. Vanessa entered without asking permission, her steps hesitant. "I didn't come to fight," she said immediately, her voice low, almost broken. "I just wanted to understand why you were never on my side." The words pierced Harriet like an invisible blade. There was genuine pain in her tone, but also an insistence on shifting blame. Harriet took a deep breath before answering. "I was there, Vanessa," he said, looking her in the eyes. "Maybe not in the way you wanted, but I was there. I didn't support mistakes because I believed you could do more. And I refused to be silent because I learned that silence can also kill." The two remained silent for a moment, staring at each other like two strangers carrying the same story. Vanessa looked away, walking to the porch. "I've lost everything," she murmured. "And now, you have them all against me." Harriet approached slowly. "No, daughter. They're not against you. They're against the choices you've made, and you can still choose differently." There was no embrace, no full reconciliation, just a pause filled with possibility. Harriet knew there might never be a complete return, but she also understood that this moment was, in itself, a breakthrough. After Vanessa left, Harriet spent hours sitting on the porch, gazing at the stars. She felt empty, but also at peace. For the first time, there was no anger in her heart, only acceptance. She understood that some relationships never go back to the way they were, and that her mission now was to move forward without expecting any more recognition from her daughter. The foundation continued to grow. Women began organizing small businesses with mutual support, craft projects, community gardens, and even reading groups. Harriet watched them with admiration, realizing that what had begun as a family war was now blossoming into a movement of collective reconstruction. The vineyard became not just a setting, but a living part of this transformation. Clara, in one of her most read articles, summed up the impact in one sentence. Harriet Monroe showed that a legacy isn't measured in numbers, but in how many lives it touches. Smiled with words, tears in her Harriet, eyes. She hadn't sought to be a symbol, but somehow her silent struggle had become an inspiration. Over time, the Lydia Monroe Foundation grew out of its local reach and began to attract regional attention. Invitations to lecture at universities, women's association meetings, and even television appearances began to pour in. Harriet, initially reluctant, accepted some of them, realizing that her voice could reach even more women who had been silenced. Each time she told, she did so not as a heroine, but as a survivor, and that was precisely what inspired her. At one of these lectures at a nearby university, Harriet spoke before more than 200 students and faculty. She recounted the funeral, Vanessa's accusations, the courtroom, and the moment she decided to turn her pain into action. The audience remained completely silent throughout her talk, and at the end she received a standing ovation. For Harriet, this wasn't a prize, but confirmation. Her life, once marked by obscurity, had now become a beacon. The vineyard, meanwhile, was thriving. Samuel had implemented improvements in production, incorporating modern techniques without sacrificing traditional craftsmanship. That year's vintage won an award at a regional agricultural fair, and Harriet accepted the trophy on behalf of the team. Holding the award, she thought of Lydia and was certain her sister would beam with pride, happy to see that the legacy was not only preserved, but flourishing. The foundation, in turn, began to receive financial support from donors who believed in the cause. With this, Harriet was able to expand her activities. She created professional training programs, therapeutic meetings, and even partnerships with small businesses willing to employ women over 50. The space, previously limited to discussion groups, now had equipped rooms and a team of dedicated volunteers. Clara followed each stage, transforming the growth into powerful narratives that reached even more people. The articles highlighted not only Harriet, but also the women who had rebuilt their lives through the foundation. Stories of individual overcoming were highlighted, showing the world that the impact of that decision transcended borders. Harriet read each article with a mixture of pride and humility. She knew that the leading role wasn't just hers, but everyone who chose to start over. Vanessa, meanwhile, remained distant. Harriet received scattered news through acquaintances, but there were no new attempts at connection. Curiously, this no longer caused her the same pain. She had learned to live with absence without letting it define her life. If reconciliation ever came, it would be welcome. If it didn't, life would go on. This detachment wasn't coldness, but hard-won maturity. One spring afternoon, the foundation organized a large community gathering, bringing together dozens of women and their families. There was music, craft stalls, and wine tasting. Harriet walked among the people and felt the space pulsate with life. Seeing children running between the tables and women exchanging hugs and stories, she understood that the vineyard was no longer just heritage. It was the scene of a collective rebirth. During this event, a woman named Helena approached and took her hands. "I had given up on myself, Harriet. I thought there was no future after my husband abandoned me. But here I found the strength to start over. Today, I opened my own sewing business. You have no idea what that means." Harriet, overcome with emotion, simply replied, "Yes, I do, because I also thought there was no future for me." These meetings reinforced the conviction that Lydia's legacy lived on in ways Lydia herself could never have imagined. Her sister had left land, livestock, and possessions, but above all, she had left Harriet the mission of transforming inheritance into hope. Each foundation project was, for Harriet, an invisible letter from Lydia saying, "Keep going. You are exactly where you're supposed to be." Maxwell, who had followed her entire journey, once commented, "Do you realize you're no longer just defending heritage? You're making history." Harriet smiled. aware she hadn't sought it out, but happy to have found it. For the first time in years, she felt like she owned her narrative. At night, when she walked alone through the vineyard, she liked to think of each star in the sky as a memory. Some shone brighter, like Lydia, others more distant, like Vanessa, but they were all part of the constellation of her life, and as she looked up, she knew her role was not to extinguish the stars that were receding, but to keep alive the light that could still shine. Thus, amid ripe grapes, reborn female voices, and the memory of her sister, Harriet discovered something she had never fully experienced: peace. Not a static peace, but an active peace made of daily choices, silent struggles, and shared victories. And this peace, she understood, was the true fruit of her journey. The following summer brought one of the vineyard's most abundant harvests. The vines were laden, the clusters glistened in the intense sun, and the sweet aroma of ripe grapes filled the air. Harriet walked between the rows with a new sensation. Each berry seemed a living testament to her resilience. She no longer saw just grapes. She saw chapters in a story that had survived rejection, defamation, and attempts to erase it. During community-organized Harvest Festival, Harriet was invited to give a speech. She stepped onto the small makeshift stage, holding a glass of freshly harvested wine. "This place," she said, looking out at the attentive faces, "is not just land. It is memory, it is struggle, and it is hope. Each of you is part of this story, and together we prove that legacy is not sold, it is cultivated." The applause that followed was not just celebration, but recognition. Clarara captured that moment in images and words that made the rounds of newspapers. The photo of Harriet raising the cup at sunset, surrounded by women, workers, and children, became iconic. For many, it was a portrait of victory, not over Vanessa, but over oblivion. Harriet saw herself with astonishment, transformed into a symbol of something greater than she had ever dared dream. Meanwhile, the foundation was taking shape. New programs were launched: entrepreneurship workshops, collective garden projects, literary gatherings. Each new women joined the group, bringing their pain and strength. Harriet positioned herself not as a savior, but as a partner in the journey. She knew how to listen, she knew how to welcome, and that was enough to create deep bonds. At one of the meetings, a young journalist asked, "What would you say is your greatest victory?" Harriet thought for a moment and replied, "My greatest victory wasn't winning in court. It was learning that the silence that suffocated me could be transformed into a voice that liberates. First mine, then that of so many others." This phrase was reproduced in headlines, echoing like a manifesto. Vanessa, though distant, hadn't disappeared completely. Reports were circulating that she was trying to rebuild her life in another city, away from the spotlight. Harriet, upon hearing this, felt no resentment. She simply hoped that her daughter would eventually find what she had found: peace. She no longer needed Vanessa to return to feel whole. This was perhaps the greatest change within herself. Samuel remained by her side, tirelessly tending the vineyard. One afternoon, as they walked among the vines, he commented, "The earth responds to the hand that tends it, Harriet, and it is responding to you." Harriet smiled. That simple phrase confirmed that she was on the right path. Elenina, for her part, followed her friend's every step with admiration. "You turned a war into a legacy," she said at one of the foundation meetings, "and no one can erase that. Not even the complicated history with Vanessa, because what you built here already belongs to many." Harriet knew it was true. The vineyard and the foundation were already greater than their individual pains. As recognition grew, so did responsibility. Harriet refused to be dazzled. She continued to live a simple life, waking up early, tending the land, and attending foundation meetings. Her expression conveyed serenity, but also the firmness of someone who knew the weight of what she had overcome. One night, while revisiting Lydia's letters, she came across a phrase she had never noticed so clearly. Our greatest legacy is not what we leave behind, but what we plant in those who carry it on. Harriet closed her eyes, clutching the paper tightly, and wept silently. She sensed that, somehow, Lydia had already known that she would find her own voice through her pain. The vineyard, the foundation, the community, everything intertwined in a web Harriet could never have imagined on the day of the funeral. If before she had been seen as a shadow, now she was a discreet but steady light illuminating paths. She no longer needed to prove anything to Vanessa, the town, or herself. Her story was recorded not only in documents, but in transformed lives. In that moment of contemplation, Harriet realized that her journey of overcoming obstacles didn't end there. It would continue every day, with each tended vine, each supported woman, each decision made with dignity. And this, she thought, was much more than victory. It was freedom. The following autumn, the vineyard took on intense colors. Orange and red leaves painted the horizon, creating a landscape that seemed to have come straight out of a painting. Harriet walked between the rows as usual, but there was something different in her gaze. It wasn't just contemplation, it was fulfillment. For the first time in decades, she felt at peace with herself, free from emotional debt, free from the urge to prove anything, anyone. During this same period, the Lydia Monroe Foundation held its largest event to date, a statewide gathering of women over 50. More than 300 participants came from various regions, sharing stories of abandonment, reinvention, and courage. Harriet, as she took the stage, looked out over the crowd and felt she was facing something greater than herself. "I thought my struggle was lonely," she said. "Today I see that there are many of us, and that together we no longer need to live in silence." The applause was thunderous, but what truly touched Harriet wasn't the flashbulbs or the headlines the next day. It was the hugs from each woman who reached out to her at the end, thanking her for creating that space. It was as if each of them gave Harriet back a piece of strength she had lost in the past. There, she understood that the foundation wasn't just a project, it was the embodiment of her healing. Vanessa didn't attend the event, but she sent a short letter. It simply said, "I still don't know how to forgive or how to ask for forgiveness, but I saw your talk online. Maybe one day I'll be able to be there." Harriet read those lines with tears in her eyes. She didn't respond immediately. She kept the letter in the same box where she kept Lydia's. She understood that some stories don't end with full reconciliation, but with small glimpses into the future, and that was enough. As the months passed, the vineyard became a landmark not only for agriculture, but also for culture and society. Schools organized tours, groups came to visit the foundation, and journalists sought to interview Harriet about aging, resilience, and legacy. Having always lived outside the spotlight, Harriet learned to handle the spotlight gracefully, without letting it overwhelm her. She knew the attention wasn't for her, but for the cause she represented. On a special evening, the foundation hosted a benefit dinner among the lantern-lit vines. Women who had rebuilt their lives gave moving testimonies, recounting achievements ranging from starting small businesses to regaining their self-esteem. Harriet, sitting at the head of the table, looked at each of them and realized that this was the true fruit of the vineyard, not bottled wine, but transformed lives. Elena, watching from afar, commented to Samuel, "She's become what she was always meant to be." Samuel simply nodded, his eyes welling up. To him, Harriet wasn't just the owner of the vineyard, she was the root that held this entire transformation together. When the night ended and the lights were dimmed, Harriet stood alone among the grapevines, gazing up at the starry sky. She felt Lydia's presence as never before, as if her sister were watching her with pride. She whispered softly, "I did it, Lyd. The legacy lives on." The gentle wind that blew through the leaves seemed to be the answer she needed. In the following days, Harriet made official something that had already been happening in practice. A portion of the vineyard's profits would be allocated annually to the foundation's upkeep. This ensured that, even after her departure, the work would continue. It was the closing of a cycle. The inheritance that had nearly destroyed her was transformed into a permanent source of life and hope. Clara wrote the final report of this stage with a title that summed it all up: From Parasite to Guardian: How Harriet Monroe Transformed Pain into Freedom. Upon reading, Harriet smiled, not because of the label or the recognition, but because she knew that, in fact, her life had ceased to be defined by the wounds inflicted by others. Now it was defined by the choices she herself made. The vineyard continued to flourish, the foundation expanded, and Harriet grew old amidst the silent applause of the community. She hadn't completely won back her daughter, but she had achieved something greater. She had won herself, and that victory no one could take away from her. At the last harvest in which she actively participated, her hair now completely white and her gait slower, Harriet raised a glass of wine at sunset and said to the women around her, "May we never again live in silence." In that toast, the true meaning of her journey was sealed, transforming pain into legacy, absence into presence, silence into voice.